It was the summer of 1985. I was leaving my job in Chicago and I was going to enter the seminary that fall. But in the summertime, I was still at my job, and one of our vice presidents, Judy, held a pool party for some of the employees anyway. I was one of them. And it was just a great afternoon. And at one point, Judy came up to me and started speaking pleasantly enough. But then, after about a minute, I think, the conversation turned. Basically, Judy was confused about why I wanted to be a priest. I don't really remember how I responded to all that, but it took me just a little time to get down to the real issue for Judy. It wasn't so much about me becoming a priest, it was about her not believing in God. How can there be a God? I remember her asking me. How can there be a God when there is so much suffering in this world? She meant so much sickness, so many accidents, so many natural disasters. Again, I remember at the time not really knowing how to respond to her. Now, I could have thought to myself, maybe she's right. Maybe I am making a mistake. My guess is that we have all had a Judy in our lives, someone who questions our belief in God or our commitment to the church and to Mass, or our desire to serve as a disciple of Jesus Christ. Maybe it's been a friend, maybe it's been a family member, maybe it's somebody we don't even know very well. And maybe, like for me, it caused you to question even just a little bit your behavior. Why pray? Why go to Mass? In the midst of so much suffering in the world, why believe in God at all? The absurdity, if you want to call it that, is especially poignant when those who are in agony are innocent victims. What kind of God would allow it? How can a God who is all loving and all powerful tolerate so much misery in his creatures? This so-called problem of evil seems to be in the background of our first reading tonight from the Acts of the Apostles. Paul and Barnabas strengthened the spirit of the disciples and encouraged them to persevere in faith. They said, probably in the midst of a suffering church, this: It is necessary for us to undergo many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. In other words, Paul and Barnabas understood that pain and suffering, while never fun, are basically our entrance tickets into heaven. Great. But the question remains, why? Why is suffering necessary? In my first year of seminary, I read the book When Bad Things Happen to Good People by Rabbi Harold Kushner. Finally, I thought as I began, I'll find out the answers that I should have had ready for Judy when she questioned me about God's existence. Now, if you yourself read When Bad Things Happen to Good People, you may remember that Rabbi Kushner offers no definitive answers. Mostly, he asks some pretty good questions. Questions like this: what if we suffer in order to sympathize with the suffering of others? The idea here, of course, is that nobody understands suffering better than somebody who has gone through the same thing themselves. That makes sense. But we're still left with that line from the Acts of the Apostles. It is necessary for us to undergo many hardships to enter the kingdom of God. The easiest answer to the coexistence of God and evil is this: it's God's will. You've probably heard that, and I bet you've said it a time or two. And it's true, but only if we understand an important distinction. The distinction is between God's perfect will and God's permissive will. God's perfect will is peace, love, harmony. No wars, no hunger, no poverty. God's perfect will is an understanding that God does not will evil. Evil sometimes happens, however, because of God's permissive will. Why does God permit the bad to happen? Number one, in order to preserve human freedom. And number two, to give us a chance to grow in our trust that God can and will turn all to good. Darkness leads to light. Despair leads to hope. Death leads to life. Earth leads to heaven. God will turn bad to good. The problem is that we're not always so patient when that process is unfolding. Now, if we had been the creators instead of the created, this world may be different. Of course, the big crucifix behind me, in front of you, reminds us that our God has not left us alone and never will. We are therefore a people of hope.